So I'm saying that the primary reason why I'm reading that is because it was not taught at school, and it's very important. It's part of our history in Canada, the Metis, and the only time I heard about the Metis is because I heard about Louis Riel, and of course they rewrite history, so they tell it the way they want to tell it to us, and not the truth, not the facts. Continuing, after Brady and Norris joined the movement in 1932, the first of several provincial organizations was founded, the Metis Association of Alberta, open to all persons of Aboriginal ancestry. Its efforts led to the appointment of the Ewing Commission in 1934-36 to make inquiry into the condition of the half-breed population of Alberta. This is between commas from make inquiry into the condition of and finishing by the word Alberta. The association eventually secured land for Metis settlements alongside the passage of the Metis Population Betterment Act in 1938. In the same year, the Saskatchewan Metis Society, later the Association of Metis and Non-Status Indians of Saskatchewan, was founded and began to organize for the recognition and protection of Metis rights. Metis organizing and the constitutional era in the late 1960s. That's interesting. It says in those anyways, Metis political activity intensified with the founding of numerous other organizations like the Manitoba Métis Federation, the Ontario Métis and Non-Status Indian Association, and the Louis Riel Métis Association of BC for British Columbia. These organizations confronted such issues as the federal government's White Paper of 1969 and the ongoing exclusion of Métis and non-status Indians from federal policy considerations. In the 1970s, alongside their non-status Indian counterparts, Métis organizations were successful in developing programming, providing social, economic, and educational support for Aboriginal peoples. However, due to the federal policy that limited federal funding to Métis and non-status Indians, those groups dealt mostly with individual provinces, which in turn considered them to be a federal concern. Nonetheless, Métis and non-status Indian organizations developed meaningful partnership with provincial governments, which have over the long term produced an impressive array of social services still in existence today. During the 1970s, Métis organizations were primarily concerned with social programming for Métis and non-status Indians, but during the leap up to Canadian constitutional patriation, Métis organizations like their Indian and Inuit counterparts were increasingly concerned about constitutional protection of their rights and title. During the patriation process, Métis successfully lobbied for inclusion in what became the Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, protecting the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples who were defined as Indian, Inuit, and Métis, while Métis and other Aboriginal rights and title remain undefiled in constitutional practice. Métis did gain a constitutional protection from unjustifiable Canadian infringement of their rights. Before the constitutional recognition of Métis Aboriginal rights, Métis and non-status Indians have worked together out of common interest and necessity. With the Métis recognized as a distinct group in 1982, the alliance began to dissolve. From 1970 to 1983, the Native Council of Canada (NCC), now the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, represented Métis interests on the national level. However, for the 1983 First Ministers' Conference, the Métis National Council was formed to secure Métis representation as a distinct people independent of non-status Indians. The First Ministers' Conferences of the 1980s, meant to define Section 35 Aboriginal rights, were widely regarded as a failure, and the Métis non-status split became more permanent. Métis organizations began to develop membership codes that reflected Métis specific membership, excluding many previous non-status Indian members. The court's Métis Aboriginal rights. As the recognized Métis right and title of Section 35 were never defined during the First Minister Conferences, the Métis initiated a series of lawsuits in order for the courts to determine what these rights protected. Since the constitutionalization of Métis rights, 3 major courts' decisions have started the long process of defining Métis Aboriginal rights in the Canadian constitutional system. A transformative movement in Métis rights jurisprudence came in R. versus Pauli in 2003. 2 Métis hunters, Steve and Rodi Pauli, shot and killed a moose outside the Sault Ste. Marie and were charged with hunting without a license and unlawful possession of game hunted in contravention of Ontario's Game and Fish Act. This is really ridiculous. But I saw things like that with government. Continuing. In defense, they claim that their rights as Métis allowed them to hunt in a manner consistent with their Aboriginal rights, which predated Canadian assertion of sovereignty over their community. As a result, the Supreme Court established the Pauli test for determining which Métis communities could exercise Aboriginal rights to hunt and harvest as their ancestors had done. In 2013, the Supreme Court determined that if in MMF versus Canada, the government had failed in its obligation to properly distribute and safeguard the 1.4 million acres set aside for Métis in the Manitoba Act 1870. Since this victory, the Manitoba Métis Federation has been lobbying the federal government to enter into a land claims negotiation to compensate the Métis people for lost lands and resources. Let's read this phrase again, it's very important. In 2013, the Supreme Court determined that in MMF versus Canada, the government had failed in its obligation to properly distribute and safeguard the 1.4 million acres set aside for Métis in the Manitoba Act 1870. Let's repeat again. In 2013, the Supreme Court determined that in MMF versus Canada, the government had failed in its obligation to properly distribute and safeguard the 1.4 million acres set aside for Métis in the Manitoba Act 1870. Since this victory, the Manitoba Métis Federation has been lobbying the federal government to enter into an land claims or negotiation to compensate the Métis people for lost lands and resources, with the ultimate goal of securing a legally recognized land base for Métis in Manitoba. Another case, Daniels versus Canada, also have transformative potential for Métis-Canada relations. Though the case began in 1999, the Federal Court of Canada ruled in 2013 that Métis and non-status Indians are considered Indians under federal jurisdiction under Section 91 and between parentheses 24 of the Constitution Act 1867. On appeal in 2014, the Federal Court of Appeal removed non-status Indians from the ruling. This means that jurisdiction for Métis relation falls to the federal government rather than the provinces, as has been the common practice for decades. In this case, if this case is successful on its inevitable appeals to the Supreme Court of Canada, it could potentially transform all Métis organizations' function, where their funding come from, and the kind of services they are able to offer. Association of Alberta, open to all persons of Aboriginal ancestry. Its efforts led to the appointment of the Ewing Commission in 1934-36 to make inquiry into the condition of the half-breed population of Alberta. This is between commas from make inquiry into the condition of recognition and protection of Métis rights. Métis organizing and the constitutional era in the late 1960s. That's interesting. It says in those Métis political activity intensified with the founding of numerous other and finishing by the word Alberta. The association eventually secured land for Métis settlements alongside the passage of the Métis Population Betterment Act in 1938. In the same year, the Saskatchewan Métis Society, later the Association of Métis and Non-Status Indians of Saskatchewan, was founded and began to organize for the. So I'm saying that the primary reason why I'm reading that is because it was not taught at school, and it's very important. It's part of our history in Canada, the Métis, and the only time I heard about the Métis is because I heard about Louis Riel, and of course they rewrite history, so they tell it the way they want to tell it to us, and not the truth, not the facts. Continuing, after Brady and Norris joined the movement in 1932, the first of several provincial organizations was founded, the Métis